Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 40+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify innovative applications, build skills and standards, and advance partnerships to solve global challenges. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Beery, and I'm an assistant professor at MIT with research that focuses at the intersection of AI and biodiversity. Alongside Dave Thau and Lily Xu, I'm working with the ITU to host their new series, particularly focusing on this AI for Good discovery on the intersection between AI and biodiversity. Overall, the AI for Good Discovery Series is a thematic collection of technical sessions exploring key areas being transformed by AI and machine learning, while addressing these challenges in their respective fields. So this particular focus on biodiversity, we're bringing together global experts around the world who are either machine learning researchers, biodiversity researchers, scientists, economists, who really are thinking about what the future of biodiversity monitoring might look like in conversation with AI. So today, I am incredibly excited to introduce Dr. Oisin McKay, who is a reader in machine learning at the School of Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. He is also an Ellis Scholar and a former Turing Fellow. He obtained his PhD from the University College London and was a postdoc at Caltech prior to his current role. His research interests are in the areas of self-supervised learning, 3D computer vision, fine-grained learning, and human-in-the-loop learning. In addition, he works heavily on questions related to AI for conservation and biodiversity monitoring. And today he'll be talking about AI-powered global-scale species distribution modeling. So take it away, Oisin.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. So as Sarah said, my name is Oisin McKay from the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to talk today about some work that I've been doing in my group, but also with my collaborators on this question of modeling global scale species distributions. And really, it can be kind of boiled down to one key question. So the question is, where can all species on Earth be found? And what I mean by that, in essence, is really what is the kind of spatial range or the geographic extent to which we could find, expect to find a given species. And we can multiply that then by all possible species that do exist on Earth. And so, you know, an obvious question might be, why is this actually even important in the first place? So the real crux of this is that understanding where species are spatially distributed and also temporally distributed is a pretty key piece of information in the context of our understanding of biodiversity, and more crucially about how biodiversity is actually changing as a result of climate change, as a result of habitat loss. And just to give one example on this slide here, so species ranges and an understanding of them, they inform our conservation priorities because we can target areas or regions to divert conservation efforts to, depending on the state of the species presence there and the extent to which they're imperiled. And so, you know, naively we could ask, how are we actually going to determine all these locations where a species is present? So if we did some back of the envelope math, we could say, well, okay, there's about 150 million square kilometers just on land on Earth. There's about 2 million species. If I took about a second to identify each species at that location, already I'm going to run out of time. And so this is a pretty serious data exploration problem and a pretty massive scale question in terms of its global distribution, but also its taxonomic distribution. And so thankfully, this is not the endeavor of just single individuals that have to do this. We've actually seen this amazing growth in biodiversity data over the last few years. And really, this is thanks to the confluence of a few things. So that is primarily advances in things like new sensing modalities, remote sensing, for example. It's also to do with advances in things like in situ sensors, so camera traps, audio monitoring devices. But a real driver in all this is actually people. It's participatory science efforts, platforms like iNaturalist, eBird, PlantNet, just to name a few, that are driving this massive increase in growth in biodiversity data. And so looking at kind of just one headline number for this, this is a graph from GBIF, this Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And at the start of 2025, they crossed this 3 billion occurrence threshold, where an occurrence is an observation in space and time of a given species. So you can see this kind of amazing growth over the last, whatever this is, 20 or so years. And just to single out one example, this is iNaturalist. So we've been working with, and we've been fortunate to work with iNaturalist for the last few years. And iNaturalist is this amazing platform where members of the public can get involved and collect observations about the natural world and share that with others. And what's really kind of beautiful about these platforms is they decouple the act of sensing or observing nature from the act of identifying what's present in it. So I, as a kind of a complete novice, can go out and take photographs of the natural world, and I can get assistance from other members of this community as to what's actually present in those images that I capture. And looking at kind of the headline numbers, you know, iNaturalist has about 250 million observations. So an observation, again, is a location in space and time. And the vast majority of these observations also contain photographs. So we have this really rich measurements of the natural world. And to date, they have over 500,000 species represented on the platform who have been observed by over 3.5 million people. And so this kind of big red blobby mess in the middle of my slide is indicating the spatial distribution of these observations that have been captured on this particular platform. And again, there's this amazing wealth of diversity of taxonomic entities spanning all forms of life, from vertebrates to plants, you name it, it's there. So in practice, what this data looks like when we drill down into individual species is that things are a bit more patchy. So this is an example of a banded mongoose, which is found in a bunch of different locations across Africa. And what these red dots, in a sense, they kind of represent a spatially aggregated view of the number of observation in the local region. And so we can see that we've kind of got some density of observations here on the kind of southeast coast, and then much more sparse across the middle of the continent. In practice, the range is much more dense. So this range here is a kind of an expert-derived range. You could think of this as a kind of a combination of all our understanding of the species, from on-the-ground observations from many different platforms, from dedicated monitoring efforts, from expert knowledge. This is kind of all brought together to form this map of the locations where this particular species is found. And just flicking back and forth between them, it immediately is apparent that there's a kind of a big set of gaps in terms of the data that we have on the ground versus what would be needed maybe to flesh out something like a range map of this type. And again, this is just one example. So really, some of the challenges here can be boiled down to a set of biases in the data. So one big bias is the spatial biases that are present. So for example, what we're seeing here is estimated terrestrial mammal richness. And we see we have this amazing richness. So this kind of brighter red color indicates more species. And we have this greater richness here in the kind of tropics, which tails off as we get further away. And if we look at the actual spatial distributions of observations on a platform like iNaturalist, so this is just from a snapshot in time, you can see that actually it's nearly like the complete opposite. So the places where people are observing data predominantly on these platforms are not necessarily the most biodiverse locations. So we tend to have a kind of a major bias towards like kind of global north, places like the US, places like Europe, and actually we have a kind of a lack of observation effort in other parts of the world where perhaps we maybe even need it the most. Another big bias that exists on these platforms is the taxonomic bias. So what we're doing here is we're counting the number of species, we're binning the number of species based on the number of observations that they actually have. And so if we look here on the very left of this plot, what we see is the vast majority of species actually have a very small number of observations, you know, on the order of even actually less than 100 or maybe even less than 10 in many instances. And so you notice this axis here is a log axis. So actually there's a whole bunch of species that have very limited data on these platforms. And if we go the other end, there's actually a very small number of kind of charismatic or easy to identify / globally distributed species where we have lots of observations for. So we have this kind of massive taxonomic bias or imbalance present in these data sets. And the result of all of this, going back to our original motivation of knowing where things are, is that we actually only have range maps for a relatively few number of species in the grand total. So if we think of things in terms of what's estimated to be on the order of around 9 million species that are present on Earth, about 2 million of those have been actually described by science, but a much smaller fraction, so something more like 100,000, have actually been mapped to any degree of reliability. So this is clearly a big issue. So, you know, we need to kind of prioritize conservation efforts, and one of the key pieces of data that's needed to do that is actually fundamentally missing. As an aside, so this is a kind of a seminar series about AI. One question might be, well, do modern AI tools and solutions, do they offer an out-of-the-box solution to this problem? So in some recent work, we actually asked to what extent do large language models actually possess ecological knowledge? And so I won't go into too much detail today, but one of those questions we asked, we tested these models in terms of their ability to generate plausible range maps for species. And so in essence, you could think of this as we're prompting these models to say, to ask them, given this particular species, can you generate for me a map of where you think that species might be on Earth? And this is the prediction from one of the commercial LLMs that we actually tested. And so you can see that this is effectively two rectangles on a map. It looks pretty unrealistic, and in fact, it is actually quite poor when you compare this to the expert range map for this alpine ute. And so the kind of takeaway, I guess, here, I would say, is it's actually even surprising that these models are capable of localizing things in the right part of the world. But there's certainly a massive gap between the kind of precision and quality of prediction that would be needed versus what's actually possible out of the box from these types of massively trained large language models. And we observe this kind of pattern on a whole bunch of different species as well that we test, that they really are not capable of this type of geographical reasoning. Okay, so going back to the central question, how do you actually estimate a species spatial distribution? There is a huge literature on this topic. I'm not going to be able to give it justice today. I'm just going to briefly skim over it. So there's kind of fundamental work stemming from the intersection of machine learning and ecology, like Max Ent from over 20 years ago. There's a whole set of amazing work on more hierarchical Bayesian models and probabilistic modeling to try and build in process knowledge into these and domain knowledge into these models. Recently, though, we've seen this kind of trend of the adoption of deep learning solutions, and so there's again a growing field of community of researchers who are interested in exploring this question in the context of these model neural networks. And really, what we benefit from this perspective is that we get all the advantages of what neural networks are really good at. They're really good at integrating lots of different data from different sources, large quantities of data, dealing with, to some extent, noisy data. So we have these kind of benefits that we can obtain from these models and apply it to this problem. There's actually a really good review paper that I would point people to, especially those from the kind of computer science, machine learning audience, that I think does a great job of giving an overview of this core problem. So do take a look at that. Yeah, okay, so the kind of classical approach to species range estimation is at input, I have a sparse set of observation for one species. And so what is an observation? An observation, if we ignore time for now, it's just a location in space, somewhere on the planet where that species has been observed. We're going to put that into a model. Often that's some kind of machine learning solution or machine learning model. And the output of that model then is a prediction for all locations of interest where we have high values or high probability where the species is present, denoted here by the kind of yellow color, versus low values, denoted here by dark blue, for locations where it is not present. And just for simplicity, in most of the images today, I'm just going to mask out the ocean just so we can kind of see the land more clearly. This deep learning perspective takes a different approach to the problem. So this is kind of motivated by work in what's called joint species distribution modeling. So the core idea here is that instead of just having to develop an individual model for each species, what we're going to do instead is we're going to develop one model that's trained on multiple species together. And in practice, this actually looks like a model that's trained on potentially tens of thousands of species and millions of observations. And one of the motivators for this is then actually we share information across different species. So we learn something inside of the weights of this model about co-occurrences, about interactions, and that allows us to kind of fill in some of these data gaps. It allows us to learn better representations that ultimately result in better range maps. And the output, again, of these models is these kind of continuous predictions, which we can then threshold or we can convert into binary maps. Okay, so I'm going to spend a bit of time kind of giving a bit of a high-level overview of some of the work we've been doing in this space. And while I'm going to kind of touch on some of the details, I'm not really going to go into it just in the interest of time. So as inputs, again, I denoted the idea that we had a set of observations. So here we just illustrate this using colors. So these are 3 different species. We've got green, blue, and red. And these are observations in latitude and longitude. So you can just think of these as locations on Earth. Our models are ultimately going to be neural networks, and we can think of these neural networks as containing 2 fundamental components. One is a location encoder, so one way to encode space into some abstract representation space. And the other piece is a encoding of a species, or what we call a species embedding. So effectively what we're doing is we're transforming locations on Earth into this abstract embedding space, and we're transforming species into this space. And where those 2 things are close to each other in that space, we have a high value or a high output, which indicates the species is present there. And when we have a low value, that indicates it's not. And so in essence, what we're doing then is we're training these models such that in cases where we have observations of that species, we would like to have a high probability or high prediction. So that's what we're seeing with this kind of surface here. This is the model kind of extrapolating from the prediction or from the training data we have to generate outputs where the different colors denote the predicted ranges from these models. And we've been developing solutions where we can now train these models on the order of around 50,000 species and millions of observations from data from platforms like iNaturalist. And so once trained, the kind of predictions from these models kind of allow us to explore prediction or allow us to explore ranges across globally distributed and again across a whole bunch of different taxonomic entities. So we can just see some examples here. We get a kind of a sense that these predictions that kind of plausibly capture the input distribution of data that we see. What's quite cool, I think, is that we can then delve into these models a bit more and understand what they actually have fundamentally learned. And so we can look at the representation or this transformation or embedding of space that these models have captured. And what we see is in this kind of small data regime, so if we train versions of these models with small amounts of data, we see that these models kind of broadly capture broad geographic distinctions between locations, but actually they don't really capture any kind of spatial detail. And as we add more data to these models, kind of what we observe is kind of environment or geographical features start emerging. So for example, we have like Sierra Mountains or the Andes. So these types of underlying physical structures that are responsible, in some sense, or constrain the types of species that are present in a location, they emerge from the model that is just trained on actual raw species observation. So what we're seeing here is, in some sense, more data that we provide these models allow them actually to fundamentally learn a better representation of physical space. And I should have denoted, but what we're seeing here is a kind of a visualization of the representation that the model has learned. And we can do the same thing for the actual encoding of species. We can delve into what that actually looks like. So if you recall, we have this location encoding of location. We also have this encoding of species. And we can project all of those 50,000 species down into some low-dimensional space. So that's what each of these dots represent. Each dot is a different species. And here I've just highlighted three examples. And so if we looked, for example, one particular species, here this red one, exists in this location in space. And actually, if we run this model then everywhere on Earth, we see this kind of corresponding range map or prediction for the model for that species. And what's quite cool is we can walk around this species encoding space. You can see the red dot moving. And species that are close to each other in this space have similar geographical ranges. And so what we're seeing is that the model has effectively learned to encode species in a way that similarities between species and their ranges result in those species existing in similar places in this learned space. And that hopefully gives a bit of intuition as to ultimately what these models are learning. They're learning something about similarity between species based on the sparse observation data that we have. Okay, and so going back to this narrative of more data actually helps, what's really cool is that we can actually see that as we add more data to our models during training, so this is a model trained on a small amount of data versus a model trained on a larger amount of data, we actually see significant improvements in performance. And we can measure, in some sense, this performance in terms of the similarity between predictions we make and range maps that we have for a small number of species where we kind of trust that they're reliable and well created. And so more data helps is good to see. But what's actually really quite interesting in my mind is that actually we can add data from completely different species. So the first set of plots are results from a model just trained on 10 observations from 500 bird species or 1,000 observations from 500 bird species. If we add in a whole bunch of different data from different taxonomic groups like plants, mammals, etc., what we see is actually we're seeing improvements in performance just by adding more data from these different species. So this really kind of supports this view that actually different data from distinct taxonomic entities actually results in us learning better representations and making better predictions. And we see this in the map, we don't have to dwell on it, but when we train on a small number of examples, we have lots of errors denoted here in red. And as we add more examples of training examples, we see improved predictions. So yeah, along with our collaborators at iNaturalist, they've actually deployed versions of these models on their platform, primarily to improve computer vision predictions. But we can see some examples here of the kind of outputs from these models. They allow us to do things like measure, for example, the size of ranges of different species. And going back to this use case of computer vision, so on these platforms now, we have automated AI methods that can take photographs and predict which species might be present in that photograph. And what we can do now with these spatial priors or these geographical ranges that we're predicting is we can combine those with the image classifiers, and we can actually say, well, conditioned on this image that I see, and if I saw it at this location, what species do you think might be present? And the idea being that there's many instances where species might look similar, but they're found in completely different locations on Earth. And so using knowledge of where species are geographically located actually helps us improve our vision performance. And that's what we see here. So we're seeing two different versions of their model, an older one and newer one, which is not so important. But the dark green represents the performance of the image classifier alone, and the light green shows us the performance boost that we get when we combine computer vision models with these types of spatial priors or these range maps that we're predicting. And what's quite exciting is that the team at iNaturalist are doing this on training models on the order of 100,000 different species. And we see broadly, if we break down performance across different taxonomic groups, we see a kind of a consistent performance improvement across these different high-level groups, whether it be reptiles and plants and so on. And interestingly as well, we also see this across different geographic regions. So this is not just kind of limited to, for example, North America or Europe. We actually see improvements overall across a whole bunch of different places. Yeah, and so with these models now, we can do things like anomaly detection. So we can look for observations for species that are outside of their expected normal range. And here's, I think, is a really cool example. And there's a link below, you can read more about it. But there is an example here of this Duro spider, a venomous spider that was recently observed in Boston, or was some time back. And we can identify this as being kind of an unusual observation compared to its typical range that we would expect to see in North America. And this is in practice an invasive species that's typically found in Asia. And then just a few months back, iNaturalist actually packaged all of these predicted ranges up and to create this open range map dataset. So this is kind of our attempt to bring together all of these predictions into a kind of a data product that will be useful and usable by scientists and people in this area to understand the spatial distribution of species that were kind of previously unmapped. And so this is a kind of a starting point in this direction, and there's lots more we want to do to improve the quality of these maps. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes moving away from kind of what we're doing now into the kinds of things we're looking at next, and I think pointing to some of the capabilities and some of the opportunities that I think are present in this area. So we looked at these deep species range estimation models, and we talked about the ability to integrate observations from lots of different species to generate better range maps. But what's, I think, quite interesting and exciting and points to the power of modern machine learning solutions is that there's a whole bunch of additional data that we can actually make use of and integrate into these models. And so just to give one example, there is information in the form of text. So there's loads of text information out there in the academic literature or online describing different species and their habitat preferences. And because of the flexibility of modern multimodal models, we can actually integrate this information into the distribution models we're training, and I'll show later that that actually results in improved predictions overall. So yeah, so really, in essence, what this work is trying to do is come up with different ways or alternative ways to help us learn these embeddings of species. And text is this very obvious piece of supervision. So for many species, there exists this rich text description where actually we have some insight into the kinds of habitats or even information about the kind of ranges that those species might exhibit. So in this example here, we're seeing that this particular species favors scrubby woodland and forest edges. So this is really giving us a lot of information that just isn't present in a small number of geographic observations. And we can train large language models that integrate this information into the kinds of range models that we presented earlier on. And crucially, I think what's important here is we can do this in a kind of a resource constrained setting. So we're not training these models from scratch. We're bootstrapping pre-trained models such that we have a kind of like a more energy efficient, I suppose, way of thinking about training these models. And yeah, in practice, in our case, this information is sourced from Wikipedia articles. So there's about 40,000 Wikipedia articles that we pull data from, and we use that to train these models. And so I think what's quite exciting and points to maybe some of the capabilities from these models is that now we can do things like we can take text descriptions for species that are not even present in the model during training, and we can just pass this text as input to the model without any observations, and we can see the predictions from the model of what it thinks the kinds of locations a species as described by this text where they might occur. And in this example here, this piece on the left here, the yellow shows the expert range map, and we can see the model is, while not particularly accurate, it's actually doing something broadly sensible. And so what's kind of interesting in these models, then actually they learn how to spatially map concepts. So concepts like countries we're able to map them, or particular types of habitats. We see the models coming up with predictions of where they think those might be on the planet, or actually even distinct geographic features like the Great Lakes. What's maybe not so useful for ecologists, but it kind of points to the generalization abilities of these models. So we can show that concepts that are not even present in the species data, the species text data, like pasta, we can see where these models thinks pasta is present, or political figures, for example, or even cultural phenomena. We can see that these models actually are able to map these concepts, even though these are not explicitly in the training set. So really what we're doing is we're kind of leveraging this knowledge already encoded in the language models. Yeah, and so really ultimately what we care about is building models that are going to be accurate, reliable, produce more robust predictions. And what we see here is these models, or the deep models I've been describing earlier on, when we compare them to the models trained with text information, we actually get kind of quite a nice boost in performance. So again, ultimately we want higher predictions here, because this tells us that the predictions are closer matches to the expert range maps, and we see that this additional metadata improves things. Yeah, and so we've also been extending these models recently to integrate information not just from text, but from images. So we can put in images, for example, of species where we have no or limited observations, and we can see places where the model thinks a species like this might occur based on features from the image, like the species itself or the habitat in the background. But we can also, we also demonstrate that the model can take, for example, pictures of famous landmarks, and is able to also kind of map these concepts onto a map as well. Yeah, and so I think the direction this is going in my mind is we're trying to give users or practitioners that want to make use of these models more kind of control over the kind of predictions model would make. They have a lot of domain knowledge and expertise themselves about the kinds of species they're studying. We want to give them mechanisms or tools to be able to control the outputs of models based on that knowledge they have. And so here, for example, we're seeing a prediction for our model when you just give it one observation, one location donated here with this white dot. And this is where a species with that observation may occur according to this model. But we actually control the model by giving it text information. So we can say, well, same observation, but if it was high altitude mountains versus desert, we see that it fundamentally changes the predictions from the model. So this is kind of pointing to this capability that with just a limited number of observations, we can actually provide additional information in the form of text and control these outputs. Okay, so in the remaining few minutes I have, I just want to briefly touch on some of the challenges. And I think these challenges are going to be things that are that people in ecology and statistical ecology are very well aware of. But these, I think, are things that make this problem difficult, but they also point to research opportunities in the space. So one is data challenges. I mentioned this at the start. So the spatial, temporal, and taxonomic biases that are present in these data sets is a huge issue, and especially as we go forward to try and develop even more accurate models. Evaluation is a big issue. So we need to have mechanisms by which we can actually compare the outputs of these models to trusted ground truth so that people can make progress on these problems, even when they don't necessarily have the ecological expertise to be able to say when their models are doing the right thing. So what we lack at the moment is a kind of a large quantities of diverse, reliable range maps that we can use. There's some amazing work from other groups. For example, here is a figure from Cornell Lab of Ornithology and their status and trends models. They get this kind of moving towards a much finer grained perspective on ranges. So not just where something is, but maybe giving us information about, for example, its breeding status at different times of the year. So getting a kind of a more detailed and fine-grained sense of what's happening, I think is very important. And also, there's also this challenge of us making sure we don't reinforce errors that are in these models. So for example, if someone uploads a photograph of a panda in a zoo in Vienna, we don't want to incorporate that into our distribution models and fundamentally bias those models and reinforce errors in our computer vision predictions down the line as well. So these are kind of things we need to be very conscious of, that the models that we generate don't just kind of pollute the data that's available and ruin a lot of the hard work that people are already undertaking. So with that, some kind of key takeaways, I think, and summary is that what is possible now is that we can estimate plausible range maps. So certainly at this kind of coarser spatial resolution from noisy and biased data from these community science projects. We can train these models jointly on multiple species, and that actually helps. That really improves the predictions compared to just training models independently on species. And auxiliary information, which is out there and widely available, really can help a lot. And I think that's quite exciting. But there's definitely still a lot of open challenges. And I would encourage people to kind of look into this space because I think there's a lot that can be done. So a big thanks to all of my collaborators. All of these people here have done amazing work on these projects in various capacities. Also a big thanks to the iNaturalist community for just sharing their data and putting it online and making it available to people to work with. And thanks also to our funders who are supporting this work. Yeah, there's some references here, but I have a link to my website on the bottom right where people can find those PDFs in case they're interested to learn more. Yeah, and with that, I will conclude my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oshin, both for giving such a nice overview of the sort of space of species distribution modeling and how range mapping and how AI is starting to play a role, and also some really exciting recent work of yours. So I, of course, have probably way too many questions for like the set of time that we have. But one thing that I think is like so clearly intuitive and really fascinating is this concept of sharing information across species. And I think you showed some kind of nice, like maybe preliminary analysis of possibly if you're training on more data, kind of more different species, you start to remove some of the types of errors that you're seeing. And I think also kind of implied was that as you start to add language information, you're also sort of training across multiple species. And so there is still this kind of shared information across those species that's kind of coming out in the language. You mentioned a couple examples of like kind of maybe like the spatial or habitat dimensions of that shared knowledge. So things like specifics about like high altitude versus desert. But I'm curious, as we think about kind of the collective communities that get developed or sort of evolve in these ecosystems, do you think, or have you probed at all whether there's ecosystem function that's related to the species themselves that starts to be captured in these models, and whether that type of information also gets shared taxonomically?
I think it's an amazing question. I think, the way I think about it is that traditionally, I think what was the way to approach this problem was to come up with a whole bunch of explanatory variables, maybe things that characterize the local environment, the climate, maybe the land use type, and so on, and then learn a kind of a mapping from that information to a prediction of whether a species is present there or not. I think in this regime, and by the way, I should always put the disclaimer, I'm not an ecologist, so you can kind of take what I say with 2 cents. But, I think in this large data regime, when we start getting to this larger data regime, we have kind of the data explaining to us what, how it wants to be organized. So in some sense, like the compositions of species in a given location are telling us fundamentally something about the underlying habitats that are there. So I think, I kind of touched on this slightly at the start, but there is this, I think, real opportunity to kind of discover some kind of data-driven or discovered kind of set of biomes or kind of representations of space that kind of emerge as a result of just thinking about things at such a big taxonomic scale. So I'm not sure if that got to the heart of your question. I think another thing that you pointed to is like this question of like function. I think there's a whole lot of structured information about like traits, and so some of the kind of a more trait-based representation of species and how that interacts with the environment, and learning something about the nature of those interactions. I think people have done that in the context of more traditional models, but I think it'd be really cool to think about like how you could learn that from this really noisy, messy data.
Yeah, absolutely. Or to me, it kind of begs this question. So one of the things that I think is a fundamental challenge when we're learning these representations from the data that currently exists that we know is biased is particularly if you're learning species co-occurrence, like fundamentally, as opposed to sort of independently or sort of jointly learning the locations of species based on some of these like environmental conditions, is unlike maybe what is possibly the goal behind a lot of classical species distribution models, which is this idea of like predicting now if the ecosystem changes, what species are likely to be able to still thrive in a given area. What we're learning what you're learning is a very, very accurate spatial and even temporal sort of across the year map of where things are, but it's maybe less directly usable in this concept of like predicting where things might be, for example, as the climate changes or as we see sort of anthropogenic change in the landscape. But I think some of that information is being captured in the data. It's just not clear if you have that same dimension of like maybe controllability if you're learning it fundamentally. And then one of the limitations, of course, you talked about right at the end, this idea of propagating bias from animals in zoos. But the examples that always kind of are first to mind for me are things like the presence of invasive species, which are fundamentally have never been there in the past, can't be captured in sort of where we've seen this in the past, but are now potentially spreading quite quickly, or related to kind of climate and anthropogenic change, how species ranges are shifting over time. And so I'm curious, like, if you could reflect a little bit on kind of like the benefits and maybe then also the limitations of like this type of modeling approach. And if you think there's a way to bridge that gap between like, now, I don't want to say that I believe that any of the kind of like traditional models, predictions into like extrapolations of like what things might be are necessarily correct. It's just more that it has this functionality that can be probed. Yeah. So what are the trade-offs, and can we get to something that maybe matches a little bit more of this like ecological community intent around like what they would like to be able to do with a range map beyond just saying where they are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like the core question, isn't it? Like you're pointing to a capability which is not possible with these models right now, but is actually really what the core thing that we need is. It's a kind of an ability to forecast, to predict in some kind of plausible or sensible way. And so, yes, you could obviously train these models with some kind of representation of the current climate or current land use and so on. And then you could change those things. But we run into these fundamental issues that machine learning models are not particularly good at. Is as soon as you get them, move them out of the distribution they're trained on, all bets are off and they start doing crazy things. And so I think this is like it's a non-trivial problem, I think, for a couple of reasons. So one of the reasons is that there isn't an obvious data source or data solution to this problem. So what we would do in other domains is we'd just say, okay, let's just collect data over time. We'll collect data where we've done lots of interventions, and then we can learn something about the consequences of making a change in the input. And so to some extent, you could think of like the success of machine learning solutions in the context of weather prediction. It's because there is this amazing temporal sources of data where you can see what's happened up to time t, and then you can see what happened in the future and use that as a source for trading. What's missing here, I think, is that we don't have that, so that solution isn't going to work on its own. The ability to kind of like capture all these processes, that's tough, and I think people have done a lot of amazing work on it, but it's really challenging because it's going to be unintended consequences. So maybe, the temperature increases on average, and so some species kind of ultimately dies out, but the thing that it was feeding on dies off as well as a result of that, but then maybe something else moves into that area. So you have all these like complex effects that are happening that aren't necessarily trivially modelable or easy to capture. Yeah, so I think, I don't think there's an easy answer to your very difficult question. I think that the reality is that we probably need some kind of process-based information built into those models, and the extent to which we can actually learn that from data, or at least constrain it with some high-level understanding, I think that would be quite valuable. But there does probably need to be some role for on-the-ground data before and after, space for time, these kinds of like mechanisms to get to the heart of this. But again, this is kind of fundamentally this causality problem. Like it's a fundamental challenge in AI and ML.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize this again, like though there are kind of in a lot of the more classical methods, like the intent of being able to do this, I think there's very little evidence or sort of concrete mechanisms that people have built in to evaluate how accurate those extrapolations are in time, even from these kind of like traditional habitat suitability models that are trying to model these things. I think it's just a very, very difficult statistical quantity to model. Okay, so then I also, I was so excited to see as you're kind of taking these like spatially implicit neural representation models and then thinking about how to bring in like all of this depth of knowledge coming from text and actually even then derive systems where an expert can introduce new like textual kind of like fine tuning of the ranges, et cetera. I think that's really exciting. And it starts to get into this space of like, how do we kind of build more of the unstructured knowledge in the ecological community directly into these machine learning models in one way or another? This is maybe a multi-part question, but the first one is kind of like, does this become human or expert in the loop? Like, can you actually take these like corrections of these models that are kind of being derived by that expert knowledge and kind of build that information back into the model? Have you explored sort of where that does or does not help? And then the second question is just, do you actually ever see cases where the textual input hurts? Have you dug into the performance and looked, and are there species where actually when you're adding the textual information from Wikipedia, like you actually get worse performance than if you just learn it from the observations alone?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, human in the loop, I think it feels like to me a no-brainer. No, if we want to scale these models up to millions of species and we want to have like temporal understanding about these distributions, if we're just going to sit and wait till these observations roll in, we're going to be waiting a long time. There's a lot of people who really know a lot about these species, and there's a lot of information that's not even captured in text, it's not captured in images. And it would feel like to me a kind of a shame to not try and utilize that information. So we've certainly looked at and kind of in the past have worked on ideas related to interfaces, so to allow people to kind of give us supervision in a kind of an efficient way. And you can think of this as it's just constraints we're providing to the model. So it's not that we say we have to fit the model exactly based on what this person is saying. It's more like we have some weak supervision that indicates maybe it's not there. I think it actually could be there, and we use that as a way to kind of encourage the model to augment its prediction. So I think that makes sense to me, and I think there's a secondary questions of how do you do that in a way such that people with competing views or different ideas about something don't kind of confuse the model. So that's a kind of maybe a human question rather than a modeling question. And so what was the second part of the question? Okay, does text hurt? Yeah, so I think one of the kind of not surprising ways in which this things can hurt is that as amazing as it is, repositories like Wikipedia, they're not so structured that there's not a paragraph that says this is a paragraph about the range of a species and this is a paragraph about the habitat of a species. And sometimes that information is just not there, or it's only added in a sentence or two. And so even if we put aside for a second the fact that that data might itself be unreliable or not necessarily very accurate, even just finding that data in those articles in the first place and make sure we're not training on kind of incorrect data, that's a bit of a challenge. And we certainly observe that where we take the raw data itself versus a kind of a version of it where we use models to like identify important regions in that text. We observe that second step where we filter it, that gives us a higher quality of text. But I think that there could be more to be done there. You could imagine scraping the academic literature and really pulling together all of the knowledge that's out there. And there's a lot of knowledge, I didn't even mention it, but there's a huge amount of knowledge contained in the expertise of indigenous communities or people that really know this stuff well. That might not be in the literature, but that's the kind of stuff that we should be thinking about being able to bring into these models.
Right. And then I guess along those lines, it seems like one of the really driving factors to enable any of this at all is the fact that platforms like iNaturalist exist, where you're collecting somewhat standardized, global scale and open source data. And so then maybe this begs the question of like, what is the version of that that's kind of capturing expertise from the community and kind of making it accessible to these models to sort of try to improve them broadly? Where does that live, right? And how can we think about this like wisdom of the crowd beyond just species occurrence records?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on like what that might look like? Like what's your vision for like how we actually could infrastructurally support capturing that type of information and kind of like thinking about building these, we can call them foundation models that are sort of capturing different types of input from different types of experts?
Yeah, I think there's kind of maybe two answers to that question. One is a kind of like an infrastructure question of like what are the kind of user interfaces and tools that would allow us to capture that. I think we have simple versions of that, things like Wikipedia. That's great actually. It gives you that mechanism. iNaturalist and other platforms gives you the mechanism to upload the kind of more raw observations. There's another perspective which is which I'm not saying I subscribe to, but the other perspective is okay, well, we're developing these really powerful AI models. They should be able to get in there looking at this academic literature and these models, if they were more targeted to these kinds of use cases, maybe they would do a better job of extracting this information. I didn't go into detail, but I kind of pointed a bit to some work we had done this year where we had evaluated this ecological knowledge of these models, and there's some things that they can do quite well. So kind of your conventional fact-based question answering, where there's a clear answer and that information is likely available online. They can really do that quite well in the context of these kind of ecological questions, but things related to kind of spatial understanding, stuff that's just not as well represented in the raw data, they don't necessarily do that very well. So I think those are two pieces. And then I think another piece of the puzzle is like using these models to identify gaps in data that we don't have. So kind of your conventional active learning settings, but thinking about that really with a kind of broader view of what information could be valuable. So you could imagine a system that like scrapes the literature, looks at what's available, then identifies maybe experts and asks those experts, what does it think it's missing or what information could be provided? So I think that there's questions that could be done with that more targeted data acquisition rather than passive data acquisition.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And actually this idea of like targeted data acquisition is one that I think you've explored also spatially, right? Like I really like some of your work that's looked at like how do you kind of, if you could actively sort of deploy something like the iNaturalist community to go collect observations on the ground, like how do you think about that, the optimizing that process? And I guess, do you imagine that yeah, like I think about this a lot. Like, how do we best allocate the different types of resources that are available to us if we really want to make, robust, accurate, trustworthy, ecological analysis available or monitoring available globally and for all of these different species, far beyond the most common ones or the ones that are most commonly observed. And maybe this is a bit more of a philosophical question, but I'm curious, like, what's kind of your vision for how we get there? Like, what would you see as like the key priorities if you had, an unlimited budget to build kind of like the infrastructure, the teams, or sort of, the communities that would kind of drive this progress?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the person to trust with that unlimited budget, but I think the way I would think about it is, you clearly need to bring people along. No, this isn't it's not a technical solution that will solve all of this. I think it's a problem where fundamentally people have to be engaged, and so you need people in there. I think that's what's amazing about these platforms is it's people who are just in their own time because of their interest sharing information. But at the same time, that alone is probably not going to be enough. And so I think that there's going to need to be work. And I know, for example, you Sarah, have done a huge amount of work on camera traps. So those camera traps, they serve a purpose. No, they're really great at certain types of things. Same with audio, really great at certain types of things. So some kind of like distributed network of people and sensors that are kind of strategically placed, but maybe adaptively placed, et cetera, et cetera. I think that it's presumably going to be some combination of those kinds of things. And then I think when we get into the weeds, there are definitely like questions around like survey design and how to structure survey design well, such that like we actually get a reliable information over time versus more ad hoc data collection that happens on these platforms. And so finding that balance between the tension of having something very organized and structured versus something that's much more unorganized, but maybe much more accessible and easy to engage with. I think that there's some kind of, balancing between those two that needs to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been kind of obsessed recently with this question of like, what is the value of a data point?
Mm.
Where the data point can be like a camera trap image, or a minute of bioacoustic recording, or
Yeah.
a high resolution aerial image. And like, if you say like, okay, my goal is I want the right range map for this species. What is the relative value of these different types of data? Descriptions from experts of like what they know about the species, like, and I think we don't actually have the right mechanisms to probe data value in that way. I mean, data valuation is kind of this big open question in AI, and we're starting to see some like preliminary work thinking about multimodal data valuation, at least in the context of like vision and language, when you're thinking about like where these models are learning or what they're learning from. But I think when you scale to the diversity and the complexity of biodiversity data and the fact that the data is so heterogeneously sampled, I don't think we have the right mechanisms to test it. So maybe that's like one thing where I sort of see like, we need AI innovation or sort of technical innovation to actually drive some of that insight. And I'm curious, as someone who, doesn't self-identify as an ecologist, though I'd argue you clearly contain a lot of ecological knowledge in your brain. What do you see as the biggest opportunity for AI research going forward? Like where are the spaces where you think there's kind of like the most exciting directions from the research perspective?
Yeah, I think, so again, maybe you might disagree or others might disagree. I think like one of the limiting factors to engage in this domain traditionally has been and still is to some extent is a kind of accessibility of some of the problems. So we've traditionally focused on, I think, what were more low-hanging fruit or problems that were like really tough problems, but kind of easier to engage with. So things like identifying what species are in an image or in audio. I think that makes sense. We did that because they were hard problems for these models that we're developing, but we also had a good way of evaluating if our models were successful or not. As we branch into these other areas, you kind of pointed out forecasting. It's this really tough problem. How do you even think about evaluation in that setting and measuring performance? I think like that's one of the barriers. So like it's let's call it a barrier, but also an opportunity. If people come up and find ways to kind of make some of these challenges more accessible. And I'm not advocating like simplifying them to abstraction just for the sake of it, but I think making it more accessible means that we can then make it more challenging over time. But if we have ways of kind of codifying these problems in a way that becomes more open to methods development people and allow them to kind of utilize their skill sets, I think that's a huge opportunity. So I think that's an opportunity. I think at a more concrete level, I think there's work. I know that your group has been doing it, Sarah, for example, of extracting more from the data. So, for example, an image is not just a presence of a species, but it's something about its affinity for a particular location or its interactions with other things around it or its health and its general state. So there's way more information that we're getting that we could get from all these observations that might be, something like an early warning sign for a dramatic change in the kind of state of a particular species, and I think that's not utilized, and so that's a big opportunity as well, and that really I think is going to push the capabilities of current vision language models in a way that they're really not able to do that well now at this kind of level of granularity. So I think that's another chat opportunity. What about you? What do you think are maybe some of the other big opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I agree about this kind of like how do we get more from the data we have? I think one of the other things around this idea of like data valuation that I've been kind of fascinated by is just like the context of data value. Like different users need different like accuracies of information or different sort of specificities of information. Like if you're a researcher who's looking at like relative presence of different kind of like specific bird species, then you need like a huge amount of specificity in terms of like, which individual bird, maybe the demography, like, there's a lot of specificity there, but you might not even need any information about mammals in the area, or maybe you need like some kind of high level information about like forest structure. But so I guess like this question of like, how do we understand data value, but also how do we contextualize it based on the actual actions and decisions we want to take, I think is really interesting. And actually that brings me to maybe one final question for you, specifically about, so right at the end, you showed those examples with eBird, where they're getting much more fine-grained maps and also kind of fine-grained temporally. I'm curious, like with the work you're doing, like these maps at this global scale look really impressive, but then I know when you dig in, it can be quite diffuse, or it's not necessarily like as fine-grained or as structured as you might need a range map to be able to support a decision. So I had this question for you about like, there's different users of a range map. There's kind of like the sort of local scale where it needs to be very accurate and very spatially explicit because they're going to actually make active conservation decisions like on the ground. But then there's this kind of like higher level spatial prioritization where you're thinking about like generally, what areas do we need to prioritize, or, thinking about global policy where something like this diffuse range map might be sufficient. And so I know it's a bit of a philosophical question, but how do you think about the trade-offs between like this sort of general purpose models versus like kind of the specialized needs of like conservation actors on the ground? And do you see a mechanism that takes us from these global models to highly specialized, localized models? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, when you were saying that, I guess one of the obvious things that popped into my mind is just like the spatial scale at which you care about. And so some people, like you say, are going to really care about something very local because that's what they can have power over, maybe as a land manager or just as a community. And other people really want to understand macro scale patterns and so on. So clearly, the local kind of stems from the macro, but you do start getting into these complex kind of like distinctions between like where something could be versus where it is, and is it even meaningful to predict the presence of a species at something like a meter scale resolution? Yes, maybe for plants or certain types of things, but not for other things. So I think some of these things are ultimately quite challenging when you start thinking about it that length, that scale. So yeah, I'm not sure what I can add to that. I think that like ultimately people are going to have different use cases, aren't they? And I don't think there is probably one answer as to like this is what's the answer for everyone. But my feeling is that like a better global understanding will lead to something that will at least tell us something about the relationships between species, where they likely co-occur, and maybe that could support the kind of information that's needed to make local decisions about like what should I do in terms of like if I want to increase biodiversity, what do I need to target, what things could be supported by, by this particular location.
Yeah. And I mean, even at that, like maybe slightly more zoomed out global sense, you showed that picture at the beginning of like what data was in INAT versus like the expert range map. And it seems at least somewhat clear to me that like it's pretty hard to go from like, if your data really is that sparse, to something that really captures kind of the degree that the expert range map does of kind of like filling in a lot of the gaps using a lot of other information. And I could imagine that, some of the text information is really helpful. Some of that sharing information across species is really helpful. But for example, with the open range maps you kind of worked with iNaturalist to release, was there a lot of like expert engagement and kind of refining or tuning, like going from something like these continuous features to a binarized map? Like what's the process that you currently use, and how do we make that process more sort of scalable as well?
Yeah, I mean, is a great point. I kind of glossed over it that, these models produce typically a continuous prediction. And so where you decide to threshold or convert them from 0 to 1 will actually have a big impact on the actual ultimate map that you get. The map is the thresholded version of it. And so the real challenge here is that what we'd love to have is a set of locations where we know for sure something is and we know it's not. And let's say we held them out at test time, then we could choose a threshold that kind of makes sure we keep the locations where it is inside the map and not outside it. And so we don't have that basically for most species. And so there's a whole field of work and whole body of literature on exploring these kinds of questions. We don't, just because of the scale we operate at, we don't really have like I guess, a mechanism by which we can have someone go in and look at all of those things individually. And so that really is, I suppose, one of the trade-offs. So certainly I would never claim that what we have right now is like really super accurate and should be trusted. I think it's kind of like it's a trajectory towards something better. And I think if you contrast that to like maybe more taxonomically focused efforts, for example, let's say birds, where you could really pull in experts and they could really like quabble over like what exactly is the right answer and where it should look like. I think it would be great to get there, but I think that would really involve, yeah, like a kind of quite a coordinated effort to bring together a lot of people who have that expertise. And I argue, I guess, if we're going to do that, maybe we should be bringing those people together to build evaluation data sets that we can use to ultimately quantify performance of these models, so that we can optimize them for these kind of targets that these people are setting and be able to do that in a more automated fashion.
And I think, I mean, another dimension is clearly actually the investment and capacity is quite biased taxonomically as well, right? So you think about like one of the reasons we have such beautifully fine-grained maps for birds is because you have both a huge amount of data that's been collected for birds over very large time scales, but you also have a lot of experts who are like engaging in the kind of correction and adaptation and like fitting of these parameters. We don't necessarily have that for, you know, specific, subsets of beetles, or definitely with a lot of different marine taxa that are sort of undescribed insects. So you could imagine that there's some amount of like, like rich get richer with these types of AI approaches, right? You have the data already because you've already had enough investment in the community. It enables you to kind of build these better models on top of that data that then sort of drive additional knowledge gaining or information. And the hope is that some of that maybe like has like a trickle down effect where you start to do better and better for taxa or for geospatial areas that weren't necessarily as well represented originally. But you do actually, I guess, still need the expertise to kind of engage and sort of get that improvement as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, certainly. Like, as we mentioned there, we have computer vision models now that work for about 100,000 species reasonably well. They're not perfect by any means, but they only work because people put the hard effort into actually labeling images and imparting their expertise onto their models. So we need to get to 20 times more species inside of those models. And that might seem like, oh, that's not so bad. We've already gotten like a fifth of 5% of the way there. But actually, it's the thing to remember is we've done the easy ones. We've done all the things that like people know well, they can easily observe. Actually, this huge long tail of things is going to be much harder. So I think that's a great point about like the role of humans, their expertise, and making sure that we kind of not just extract it from people, but foster it and help people get better as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This question of like, how AI can actually help drive more ecological knowledge or more widespread ecological capacity. I've seen some recent work that seems to suggest that as, ecology becomes more data centric, we're basically seeing the extinction of like field knowledge.
Interesting.
This idea that people aren't going out and like just spending the time experiencing and building this kind of deep, difficult maybe to express, but obviously informative knowledge of like how a specific place or species is derived. And I I think we can see parallels maybe in other fields as well, right? This idea that as things become more automated, more data centric, like we maybe don't have the same types of knowledge that we used to at the same scales. And so I don't know, maybe we could just finish, but you've done some really amazing work in this space of like machine teaching, right? Like how actually can we leverage the knowledge that these AI models have been able to kind of capture and then use it to drive human learning. And so I don't know, do you have any like vision for where like machine teaching might play into this space of AI and biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a cool point. So, in case anyone doesn't know, so this kind of, I guess, this space called machine teaching, broadly, this is about like computer assisted tutoring. So we have platforms like Duolingo that help us learn languages, or at least they partially help us. And so, what would platforms like that look like for other types of knowledge? And I think visual knowledge in the context of species identification skills is a really good example. So I think there's definitely a role for having computer systems that can help you learn. I think there's no replacement for getting outside and engaging with people that you respect or really respect their knowledge and learning from them. It's not like, I don't think it's about replacing that, but it's about giving people tools that they can get better themselves. And there's versions of things like this already. They're not targeted to specifically about teaching algorithms, but if you look at tools like Merlin Sound ID, it's a really like engaging thing that you can have in your pocket that helps you understand nature, and you can learn from that in the sense that it makes predictions and you can kind of like get a greater understanding yourself. So I think that there's a big role now for these types of mechanisms to help people foster their interest and help them get better, but it doesn't supplant their own intrinsic motivation or interest in the problem in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have learned a lot about plants and insects by being an iNaturalist user as well, right? Like just the process of going out and collecting observations and then sort of seeing what they are. I mean, these types of community science or citizen science tools can be a really powerful mechanism for learning. But then I don't know that I'm always really learning as effectively as I could. So maybe there is also opportunity for some of that more like algorithmic optimization of the learning process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Oshin, thank you so much for both a fascinating talk and a really valuable, or at least enjoyable for me, conversation. Yeah, with that, I think thank you all for joining, and thank you, Dr. McKay, for your knowledge.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the tough questions and the interesting conversation.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.